So today now, as I mentioned earlier, we have the second last brown bag lunch presentation for this summer. And the featured speaker today is actually our own Visitor Services Supervisor here, Britton, Boughner, who will be talking to you about baseball and its connection to Lawrence, essentially, right?
That is correct, Rich.
Okay. So Britt has done a lot of research. He's been a busy bee doing some research into this, and he's put together a great PowerPoint slide presentation, right, for you for today. And when Britt is done, we'll have the usual Q&A. Feel free to ask any questions, okay? And then at any time, feel free to help yourself to water. There's cold water, seltzer, some chocolate chip cookies over there. And again, you're all welcome to help yourself to those, okay? So I will now turn it over to Britt. It's all yours.
Well, thank you, Rich. Good afternoon, everybody. As Rich mentioned, my name is Britton Boughner. I am the Visitors Services Supervisor, and today my talk is going to be on the history of minor league baseball in Lawrence. So there's a lot of baseball in Lawrence. You got the high school baseball, you got some college baseball, but I'm focused today on minor league baseball in Lawrence, the years specifically from 1877 to 1946. And as you do when you do research, you get deeper and deeper into the weeds. So there's a lot of information. The further back you go, the harder it is to find information, as you would imagine. But I did come up with some really interesting things that you may have been already aware of or may not have been aware of. So what I'm going to do today is basically I'm going to follow a timeline. So I grabbed a timeline off of Wikipedia, Lawrence baseball history, and I'm just going to sort of follow it. As you probably know, that sometimes when you do internet research, and that's what most of this is, that sometimes the information isn't always correct or it's a little bit off, so that's why you have to keep on digging. So I'm going to follow a timeline, basically, start from 1877, and then we will end at 1946. And you will discover as we go along that you'll see that the teams start up, they fold. Leagues come, they go. So throughout that period between 1877 and 1946, you have a lot of that here in Lawrence. Now, also, just to put some of this in context, is that when we talk about minor league baseball in this area, basically we're talking about AA baseball. So you could probably compare that to like something like the Sea Dogs. So if you've ever seen the Sea Dogs game, then that's sort of at that level. So you have the major leagues, you have AAA, you have AA, and then you have single A. So this is pretty much AA, but they didn't have this particular system back during those years. So this is basically what they had. They had the minor league system, and then you had the pro system. So there's a lot of flexibility between this minor league and the major leagues. And players would go back and forth. You find out that a lot of these managers who managed the teams in Lawrence were themselves major league ball players, as you would imagine, and very colorful characters. So let's get started. We're going to start with just kind of an overview of American baseball itself. I don't know, can anybody see? Can people see? Okay, good. All right, so this is very basic. The beginning of American baseball, it comes from the English game of rounders, and there's early references to baseball in America at Princeton University in 1786, Pittsfield, Mass, 1791, and Greenwich Village in New York. Now, there was two types of games. You had your New York game, and you had your Massachusetts game. And the New York game was basically the one that sort of evolved, and it took over, and the Massachusetts game was a game where you could actually throw the ball at people, and there was no such thing as base paths. So the New York Knickerbockers in 1845, they introduced the no hitting the batter with the ball. And the Massachusetts game was very similar to the Philadelphia game. But believe it or not, I did not know this, and I learned a lot of new things during this research, but cricket remained the most popular game in America up until 1855. Now, in 1857, New York clubs, they formed the National Association of Baseball Players, and so this is 1857, and can anybody guess what grew baseball after 1857? There was an event that happened in this country that that made baseball become the popular game that it still remains today. So anybody want to chime in with a guess or the answer? Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No.
Civil War.
The Civil War, absolutely. So the Civil War was the event, the event basically that made baseball sort of become a household, or the preeminent game in America, and that's because the soldiers were playing baseball amongst themselves when they were in the camps. So after the Civil War, that's when baseball really took off, and we start developing some professional leagues, like the Cincinnati Reds, for example. They called themselves professional in 1869, and then later on they reformed again in Boston in the 1870s. Their first professional league, National League, was in 1871. So that's just kind of a general background of baseball. And now we move into the timeline for the Lawrence minor leagues. Now, we have 3 ballparks in the Lawrence area where baseball was played. So the first one is Association Grounds, and this was a ball field that was on City Island, Mill Island, and they played baseball there from 1884 to 1892. Now, could I come up with a photograph of Association Grounds? I could not find a photograph, and it just amazes me, because you would think that since they played baseball there for 8 years, that a photo would exist somewhere, that someone would have taken a photograph, but I could not find a photograph. And neither could I find a photograph of Glen Forest Park, where baseball was played for 15 years from 1895 to 1910. That was impossible. That was at the end of the trolley line, where the border of Lawrence and Methuen. So if anybody has photos of these 2 parks, I'd love to see them. I looked everywhere for a photograph. Unfortunately, I could not find one. And then finally, from 1911 to 1947, when minor league baseball ended in Lawrence, there was O'Sullivan Park. And O'Sullivan Park is where the Lawrence Boys and Girls Club is located today. So here's the association grounds. And now this is a map from 1876. I looked at other maps, but I chose this map because it's got the whole Mill Island there, City Island. So for those of you who are not familiar with the Mill Island, City Island, so you have the Merrimack River on one side, and then you have the North Canal on the other side, and this was a power canal. These mills that you see were being run by the water that was being directed from the Merrimack River through the North Canal. So this created an island, basically. And now the only place looking at this island that I could imagine that there might be a ballpark would be down here at the right-hand side, where Ferris Park is located, that area. I see some green space. Now again, this is in 1876, so baseball begins in 1877, so this diagram is taken or created a year before that. So you would think that you might see some sort of resemblance of a ball field, but I do not. So they played the first team, which I do not know what the name of that team was, but they played here at Association Grounds for a number of years. And what happened is that the Union Street Bridge that you could get over to City Island burned. And so the team temporarily moved up to Nashua. But could I find any photographs of that? I could not. So there you go. So 1877, they're in the New England Association. So again, right after the Civil War, baseball has taken off. You have a couple of professional teams, you have the National League, so it's now starting to grow. But you do not see another team in Lawrence until, here we have 1877. We do not see another team until 1884. And so I just decided that this gentleman right here, Candy Cummings, he was a member of a team that played for Lynn, the Lynn Live Oaks. And granted, he's not a Lawrence player, but I just thought that he was interesting. He played in the same league that I thought he was interesting enough to highlight here. Now, as you can see, the Lawrence team folded before the end of the season, and the league was reduced to 4 teams. But you had this gentleman, William Arthur Candy Cummings. I didn't put his last name there, but oh yes, there it is. Okay. The Civil War era superlative for Candy was the best of anything. So obviously Cummings was quite good at what he did. And he was the manager of this particular team. And he had, again, been a major league ball player. And supposedly he was the inventor of the curveball. And there was some discussion and some disagreement over that. But I think most scholars would agree that he was the guy who came up with the curveball. And supposedly he came up with that curveball by winging seashells at the beach, and he noticed that they would curve when he threw them. So that's how he basically got started. And when he first was in the league, he dominated until other players started to develop their own curveballs. And then he finally, he was just kind of he faded a little bit. But he retired at age 28, and he had a sore arm, as a lot of these gentlemen did. I mean, their careers were short-lived because they pitched so much and that they got burnt out. Of course, today you would not see that. Pitchers, starters especially, they barely go 5 innings. But these guys pitched a lot, and you'll find out as we get further along that it was just amazing how often these pitchers pitched. And a lot of times in the major leagues, they usually only carried 3 pitchers. So these guys were getting used quite a bit. And so when Cummings retired, he owned a paint and wallpaper store in Athol, actually. And he also invented this railway coupling device. I could not find a picture of it, but he got some small royalties off of that. So this picture right here is when he was playing for a team. I believe this is when he was playing for the Hartford Dark Blues. I'm not sure about that, but he's in the Hall of Fame. So that's 1884. We also have, okay, now we jump to 1884 from 1877, and we're in this new league. It's called the Massachusetts State Association. So again, teams come and go, leagues come and go, and so now Lawrence has a team, 1884, and their manager is Frank Seeley, and he was one of 5 managers that particular season. And it wasn't, tremendous. Well, again, the team folded before the end of the year, but just a little sort of spotlight on Frank Seeley, who was a Hall of Famer. You see right here, he was playing for the Boston Bean Eaters. He won 87 games and captured the first of 3 National League pennants. He was quite the manager, and that's basically what got him into the Hall of Fame, was his managerial skills. They set a league record for runs scored and became the only National League team, 1885 to 1921, to hit more than 100 home runs, and he had a phenomenal winning percentage. And interesting when you follow the history of Mr. Seeley here, I see a parallel between him and Theo Epstein, who brought the Red Sox a World Series in 2004, and when he won them a World Series with the Cubs later on. So you have Seeley here, who's playing or managing the Bean Eaters, and then he goes on to manage the Cubs, and he's also very good at assembling and talent, finding talent, and he assembled one of the 3 best infielders of all time. You probably heard of Tinker, Evers, and Chance, and they dominated, and they won 2 World Series from 1906 to 1910. And then he ended up dying from tuberculosis at 49, and one of the players Frank Chance, that he had recruited, took over the team. So 1884, get to 1885. Now we're in the Eastern New England League, okay? And one of the managers of the Lawrence team that year, or the manager, was this gentleman called Walter Watch Burnham. Now, where these nicknames come from, I'm not quite sure. Maybe perhaps it was because he was an umpire, and he was an umpire and manager in the major leagues, and then he took over the Lawrence team, won a championship in 1885 with a record of 48-31, and then he went on to manage many other teams, including, he managed, like, as you see, 2,102 games, all in the minor leagues. And he was also, at the same time, he was umpiring in the major leagues. So he kept those 2 things going, managing the minor league teams while periodically umpiring in the major leagues. And one of the games that he umpired this game where you had this pitcher, Charles Gardner, Old Hoss Radburn, pitched a no-hitter in 1885. And so, of course, when you're doing your research, you kind of spin off from Mr. Burnham and you get into Mr. Radburn, and phenomenal that here is a guy that, again, they pitched a lot back then. He won 60 games in 1884, and he pitched all 3 complete games in the World Series, winning it for the Providence Grays. So he is also in the Hall of Fame. So Burnham was there umpiring a game that Radburn had pitched in. So now we get into some other folks who were on that team, the 1884 team, and the first one is Mr. John Jocko Flynn. And he was born in Lawrence. And he played for the Chicago White Stockings, which became the Chicago Cubs when he was 22 years old. During the season, he had 23 victories, but when he got into the World Series, however, he had started having arm troubles, and so he couldn't pitch in the World Series, and the St. Louis Browns won that World Series. And again, he was a small guy, Jocko Flynn from Lawrence, and supposedly they were teasing him, the St. Louis Browns fans, because his stature was quite small, and he was being compared to the mascot, which a lot of teams had these mascots, which I find a topic for another day. And that's Willie Hahn right there as the mascot. Now, Jocko was on the team with another gentleman from Lawrence, and his name was Prunes Mulak, and I forget what his first name is. But these 2 gentlemen grew up in Lawrence, Prunes and Jocko. Again, I don't know the background of their nicknames, and they grew up playing ball in the Lawrence area, and they played on that same team, that 1884 team that I mentioned. And then they ended up with the Chicago White Stockings. And so I look at this picture, and what I find really interesting is not only if you have these two kids from Lawrence, but you also have, you know, they look so young in this photograph. And then you have the, you know, the boys amongst the men, you know, all these guys up front are, you know, bigger, mustaches. And the gentleman in the front, by the way, is Cap Anson, who is one of the most dominant players of this era. He's a Hall of Famer as well. And so I can only imagine how these two young guys felt playing for this particular team. And later on in life, as one of the reasons why Jocko didn't pitch, supposedly, not only the arm trouble, was that, and this is sort of what was maybe not unlike today, but there was a lot of drinking back then and a lot of carousing. And supposedly this sort of, they say, derailed Flynn's career as well as Mulak's career, because they both died fairly young. After their career, they, Mulak, there's George, yeah, George Mulak, Prunes Mulak. Again, I don't know where the prunes comes from, but I don't want to know. But they both died fairly young, and here's the death certificate for George Prunes Mulak. It's kind of, it's kind of a sad, thing to maybe display. But he owned a saloon, they said, on Common Street, and Jocko owned a bar. There was bars and saloons that they owned around the Lawrence area during their post-career, and again, their lives were short-lived. So this is Mulak's house where he lived. I looked up 85 Cross Street in Lawrence, and that's the house right there. So that's where he lived. So now we're moving on to, a few years later, now we're in the New England League. So Class B, basically, again, this is all sort of AA ball. The team moved to Salem during that year, 1886 to 1887, became the Salem Witches. And there was no team in Lawrence until 1892, when the Manchester Gazettes moved to Lawrence. And this gentleman, Doc Casey, he played for this particular team, and he was born in Lawrence, and he played as a third baseman in the majors for Detroit, Chicago, Brooklyn, and Montreal, and he was 10th on the all-time list of putouts, and that was during that particular time period. So with 1,312. And after retirement, and one of the reasons why, I do know this nickname, Doc, was because he became a dentist, and he used to take out the teeth or address the teeth of the fellow players. So that's how he got the nickname, to help them out with their bad teeth. And so he retires, becomes a dentist in Detroit, and opens up a drugstore. 1895. Let me see. John Irwin. John Irwin is the manager of this 1895 team. And now this is John on the left. And so he's the manager of this team. He didn't have much of a career as a major leaguer, but his brother had quite the career. And Arthur Irwin, they were both from Canada, and they both started their career with the Worcester Ruby Legs in 1882. And John was a third baseman, and his brother Arthur was a shortstop. Now, I just find it interesting that John has no nicknames, but his brother Arthur had several. And his dog, Sandy, Cutrate, Foxy, and it turns out that he had quite an interesting life, Arthur Irwin, unlike his brother, who seemed a little bit more subdued. Arthur was he was involved in a soccer league. He was all over the place. Fascinating career, fascinating life. And then when he died, it turns out that he had 2 wives in two different states. And I like this picture on the left because if you notice, you got John there, and John is swinging at a ball that has just been pitched to him. And I'm sure it was something like this, except, you know, minus the tape, where they have the ball like nailed to the bat. Because that doesn't really look like much of a swing to me. And the other thing that I found interesting about Arthur was that it was the first time that an infielder wore a glove. And the reason why he decided to wear a glove was that he had broken 2 of his fingers. So he puts a glove on, and then the next thing you know, this became sort of a trend, and you had more infielders, outfielders as well, starting to wear gloves. So we get into 1899. You have a team from Fitchburg that moves to Lawrence, and then the manager's Ed Norton. Really not much there to report. Their record was 3-14, and then they disbanded after 1 year. I don't know if it had to do with, you know, I'm thinking Ed Norton. Wasn't that? Was it, you know, there you go. Thank you. We get into 1902 to 1910. We have the Lawrence Colts. Again, not much of a record here, and you have 8 years, and they finished as high as 2nd place only once. But they were basically sort of near the bottom for most of their during the years that they existed. But they're now in the New England League. So you notice that leagues are going back and forth. So we're also, ball is being played at the other previous years. It was at Glen Forest Park, and now we're playing ball at O'Sullivan Park, again, where the Boys and Girls Club is now located. And voila, I found a photograph. So the ballpark I found is named after Edward F. O'Sullivan, who was an assistant city engineer, and he later became a state rep and senator. And he died during the Spanish-American War. And I went over the other day, and I was looking at that statue. And his name, of course, is on there. And he died from disease, which is what a lot of soldiers died from. As you discover when you do research, unfortunately, is that it's not always being wounded or being killed. It's oftentimes contracting some disease and dying from it. So the park is named after him. Now, during this particular period, we have one of the coaches of the teams and one of the managers, Phenomenal Smith. I love this name, Phenomenal Smith. So he was one of 3 managers during the 1906 season, and he had an interesting career. He was a dominant pitcher, as you can see here in the stats. You know, 58 games, 54 complete games. It's amazing. And then, you know, pitching a total of, 491 third innings, and he ended up with a record of 25-30. But he continued to play after his professional career ended in 1891. And that's what a lot of these players also did. Not everybody just kind of retired and went somewhere else. A lot of them just, after their major league careers were done, they just go down to the minor leagues, and because they still wanted to play ball, and you could maybe make a little bit of money. And so one of the stories about Phenomenal Smith was that supposedly he went to a team, and he was new to the team, and he was kind of cocky, I guess. I mean, with a nickname like Phenomenal, you might assume that, I guess. And I guess he was just was bragging so much that his team, the guys in the team, purposely lost. They made errors and everything. It was like 8 or 9 errors or something like that, and they lost the game. And the manager found out about it and scolded the players. He fined them even, but after he fined them, he let Phenomenal go. So, goodbye, Phenomenal. Now we're the Lawrence Barristers. So this is where the Lawrence teams start to have some success. Prior to this, there wasn't, not a lot of success, but during this time period, again, playing at O'Sullivan Park, now maybe because they changed their moniker from the Colts to the Barristers, maybe that contributed to their success, who knows. And they won a couple of league titles, 1912 and 1914. And the manager at the time was a gentleman by the name of Lewis Piper, and he had been a coach at Harvard, and he came over and he managed this team, and they were successful. And this is the 1912 Lawrence Barristers, and I love this photograph. I think this was could be from the Library of Congress, but Lewis Piper is the gentleman in the middle. You see how well dressed he is. And then you have, of course, this mascot, and then there's the dog, and the dog's name, by the way, is Buster. Now we move up to the 1914 Lawrence Barristers. Now, both of these teams, 1912 and 1914, there was no playoff system. They basically won the league title, and that was it. They were champions. So you get to 1914, and you see some of the players have changed, the faces of the players have changed, and no Buster. Where's Buster? The Buster's gone, and the mascot looks a little bit older. That's what, I don't know, struck me. And of course, the manager still looks the same, well dressed. Now we're going to get into Jim Thorpe. Now, so this is 1924, and this is where, when you're doing research on some of this stuff, I showed you the timeline, and not in anywhere in that timeline did they show 1924, which I found really interesting, because 1924, you have one of the greatest athletes of all time, Jim Thorpe, who played for a team called the Lawrence Independents. And there was a lot of hullabaloo when he came to play for the team. There was these intense rivalries with other teams in the league. So I'm just really surprised that the Lawrence Independents weren't mentioned. So as many of you may know already, Jim Thorpe was this incredible athlete, excelled in track and football and baseball and played basketball. He won 2 gold medals in Stockholm and the pentathlon and decathlon, but he was stripped of his medals. Right in the Olympics were in 1912, and in 1913 they took away his gold medals because he had played baseball in 1909 and 1910, making $25 a week. So he played for a number of years in Major League Baseball, but it ended in 1920. So he was a guy that was, if baseball wasn't available, he'd go play football. If he did some acting, he did everything. He was just all over the place. And so he comes to Lawrence in 1924, and he's now playing for this team. Basically, again, it's kind of it's a double-A team, but it's in a league called the Twilight League, and so they play in the later part of the day, and he has one of the best years of his life in 1924. For the season, he hits .403, 155 hits, and the team ends up 67-45, and they end up winning the championship of that particular league. And here's a little snippet from the Lawrence, I'm not sure if it was a telegram, I think it may have been the telegram, talking about Jim Thorpe's debut. And he says, it will be the first chance this season for all baseball fans in the city to get a peep at Jim Thorpe, who is clouding the sphere with reckless abandon this year. And he did. Now, what's interesting about Jim Thorpe's playing days here in Lawrence, that particular season, was that he was in the middle of a divorce from his wife. And he had met this young lady, Jim, he was 37 at the time, I believe, and he had met this young woman in Ohio, and her name was Frida Kirkpatrick, and he had become enthralled with her. She was 19, she was like, he was playing and managing this team out in Ohio, and this woman, young lady he met there, and he started up a romantic relationship with her. She was 19 at the time, he was 37. And so during this particular season, he was getting himself in shape to play baseball. But it could have also been the fact that, an older man getting in shape because he's trying to court this young lady. He talks about in these letters that were discovered in 2007 after his second wife, Frida, this is the young woman that he had met, she died at 101, and there was a bunch of letters that were discovered, correspondence from Jim Thorpe to Frida, and Jim talks about that 1924 season and how he's getting in shape and he's having the best season of his life and how he's swimming in the nearby lake for hours. So it could have been the reason why he had so much success was because of her. So recently, and this is why I sort of became fascinated with this particular subject, was that when I heard that his gold medals were finally reinstated this past July after it had been stripped away from him in 1912, and so he posthumously he's received his gold medals that he won in those Olympics. And so that's the story of Jim Thorpe. He just played one season, 1924. We get into the Lawrence Merrimacks, and this is a team that really didn't have a lot of success. The only thing I found interesting was this gentleman right here on the right. He was a manager, Lefty Tyler. He had quite a career with the Boston Braves, and of course, looking up stuff, I discovered this group called the Merrimacks. So I just threw that in there because I just thought and you find that, and maybe it was because of the particular time period, but there were a lot of things that were named Merrimacks. And of course, Merrimack, it's kind of a takeoff on Merrimack. And this particular quartet was a group that performed in the 1940s. Merrimacks weren't around a long time. They folded after the 1927 season. We get into 1933. A couple years go by. We get the Lawrence Weavers. Again, they didn't have much of a career, very unsuccessful. But the only thing about the Lawrence Weavers I find interesting is that they were an affiliate of the New York Giants. Sort of like, this is where you start to see you have a farm system here, and other than the New York Giants in one particular year, there is no real connection to a major league team. Now we're into the Lawrence Millionaires, and this is during World War II. And so you have a lot of men who have gone off to World War II. There aren't a lot of people around or men to play baseball at that time period in these particular leagues. So they're basically the talent level has sort of fallen a little bit. But we have the Lawrence Millionaires in 1946, 47, and you have some interesting alum that were part of this particular team. Now, you have George Kissel, who's the gentleman on the left. He managed the team in 1946, and didn't really have a great record. Well, actually he did, I'm sorry, 65 and 53, decent. And he actually managed the team for 2 years. Now, George Kissel goes on to manage in the St. Louis Cardinals system, and he was there for over 60 years. He was a scout, he was a manager, and he's in the Missouri Baseball Hall of Fame. So George Kissel. And then the gentleman in the middle, if anybody has ever seen Bull Durham, thank you, Dan. The movie's based on this gentleman, Crash Davis. His brother, Hugh, also played on the team in that particular year in 1946. So Crash Davis is the main character in that movie. And while he was on this team, he hit .298, so he had a pretty good year. And then you have Roy Campanella, who did not play for Lawrence. He actually played in Nashua. And an interesting story about Roy was that he was the first African American to manage a team in 1946 because the manager at the time got thrown out of the game. And so Roy took over and he managed the rest of the game, and they ended up winning that game. They were playing Lawrence, by the way. And he was the New England League MVP, and Roy hit .290. Now, the Lawrence team eventually moved over to Lowell, and they became the Lowell Orphans, and that's where it basically ended. So Lawrence didn't have a minor league team anymore, and so that's pretty much the end of the line for minor league baseball in Lawrence. So that's it. Any questions?
Was the Casey Bridge named after the fellow you mentioned?
The Casey Bridge, I do not know, although someone pointed out, you pointed out, Casey at the Bat was written in Lawrence, a quarter mile away from here, or less than a quarter, right up over next to the Masonic Temple. I did not know that, so thank you for coming.
Yeah.